Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll try to get started now. It's a pleasure to welcome you to Carnegie. I'm Kareem Sajidpour. I don't run the Middle East program. I'm part of the Middle East program here. And I've been trying to put this panel together on the economy for a long time, kind of a microcosm of what the Obama administration has been trying to do with the sanctions at the UN. I think it took more time than I expected, but I'm delighted to have a really superb group of individuals, people whose work I've been reading and admiring for some time. On my far left is Kayvon Harris. Despite the name, he's actually Iranian-American. He just spent a year in traveling, not only in Tehran, but throughout the country. And he's going to be talking about some microeconomic trends he's observed. To my immediate left is Matt Levitt from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, who worked in the Treasury Administration prior, and he's going to be talking about some of the U.S. government approach towards sanctions and the logistics and legalities, etc. To my right is Hossein Askari from George Washington University. You have all of their bios in front of you, but it's also worthwhile mentioning that Hossein was an informal former advisor to several Iranian governments, and his work on Iran is very highly respected. He's a well sought-out speaker. And to my far right is Farid Mohammadi, who usually charges everyone to see his presentations, but he's very graciously giving us a free copy today from PFC Energy. And I've asked each of them to be maybe more concise, a little more concise than they usually are, because I think the best part of these talks here at Carnegie are the questions. So hopefully we'll speak up here. There will be a discussion, not a debate, 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have a long time for Q&A. And I just want to point out before we hand it over to Hossein that some of you may have read the news the last week in Iran that a senior cleric said that scantily clad individuals are the cause of earthquakes. And it's actually a true story. I'm not making it up. So I wanted to thank the speakers for resisting the urge to show cleavage today. So please, Hossein, starting out.
Thank you so much, Karim. I was asked to kind of give you a background on the Iranian economy. So if I say 90% of what I say you already know, do please forgive me. And if I put you to sleep, also forgive me. Let me try to put some context about Iran. And I'm sure some of you will say, well, these are not the same. But if you look at 1975, in current dollars, Iran's GDP was about 49 billion. Saudi Arabia's, a country that I've spent a lot of my life in, was actually 46 billion. And South Korea's was 21. In 1980, in the same ratio, 93, 164, 62. And of course, that is very easy to explain. Oil prices, if you recall, went up. Saudi Arabia's oil production went up in 1980. Iran's was down. And so Saudi Arabia did very well. Iran was still ahead of South Korea, though. But in 2007, Iran's GDP, again, in dollars, not in purchasing power parity, was 286 billion. Saudi Arabia's was 383, and South Korea's was 970. Now, I think that should actually tell you something, that for those of you who I think a lot of people will disagree with me, but that's okay. That's what makes life very interesting, is that the claim that Iran has done very well, that is absolutely not true. Iran and Saudi Arabia, as you all know, are oil economies. And I think the amount of my life that I have spent looking at these economies, I think one thing that is very, very true is that really for an oil economy, what they have to do is they have to basically transform what they have under the ground into something else, whether it is a la Abu Dhabi, money outside, or development inside the country. They're in the transformation business. This is something I think that the Minister of Finance of Saudi Arabia used to like to say, that that's what their business is all about, is in transformation. And to do that well, I think you need good institutions. Now, Saudi Arabia has lousy institutions, but let me assure you, as again, someone who's lived in Saudi Arabia many, many years, and visited Iran many times. I think Saudi Arabia's institutions are even better than Iran's. Now, some of you may have a hard time believing that, but I think that that is true. What you notice in the case of Iran, it is basically personalities. That's what matters. And, you know, I remember vividly, you know, a very, very close friend of mine who used to be the head of the central bank when he died. And the next week when I was in Tehran, everything was different. I said, well, what? This man said that. Oh, we've addressed all those problems. Everything is new. So that's the way I think that Iran really works. Now, in the case of Iran, why it's different than Saudi Arabia, there are many reasons, but I think Iran has had some special problems, which you might say is you know, outside of their control, at least somewhat. There was a revolution. There was the Iran-Iraq war, rapid population growth in the 1980s before they discovered that, in fact, it was okay to maybe use condoms. And the sanctions, which I think have not always been very, very effective. But really, Iran's economic problems, in my view, and I could be wrong, are really self-inflicted. Yes, the war had an enormous effect on Iran's economy. I absolutely realize that. But I think that, you know, and the revolution did, but a lot of Iran's problems have been self-inflicted, and that's really what I want to talk to you about in the few minutes that I have. And of course, I, being a Shiite too, you know, we Shiites, we love to inflict ourselves with these things, and that's maybe the only way that the current government has shown that they're religious, at least, is on inflicting this economic misery on themselves. In the case of Iran, as you recall, right after the revolution, Iran nationalized many things, and a lot of the assets of the various you know, entities like Iran National and the Pahlavi Foundation were overtaken, and they were put into these bonyads, or into these foundations. And so that if you now were to include all of those foundations and the part of the Iranian government in addition to it, by my estimate, and again I could be wrong, roughly 65 to 70% of the Iranian economy is controlled by the government or by the foundation. So Iran is, while everybody else has kind of been marching in the other direction, even Saudi Arabia, Iran's privatization program really has not succeeded that much, and Iran has nationalized many of these things. The other thing that Iran has done, Iran has also adopted very costly subsidies. That, of course, also came out of the war with Iraq, and subsidies are very, very difficult to reduce. Again, if any of you are interested in reading something about subsidies, I kind of spent maybe 2 or 3 years of my life trying to estimate what those were actually for Saudi Arabia, and they're massive. I mean, you know, and I realize Saudi Arabia has massive subsidies, but in a sense, and again, this, you should disagree with me in this, you know, what I'm really about to say, is that Iran can afford it less than Saudi Arabia. Now, nobody can really afford it, but I promise you that Iran cannot afford it as much. And so when you look at the Iranian economy, over the years, depending on what was the price of oil and what subsidies they gave, you know, Iran's subsidies have maybe taken up anywhere, you know, between 18 to almost 30% of Iran's GDP. That's a very, very costly thing for Iran to do. And one of the most fascinating evenings that I ever had in my life, you know, when I used to go to Iran a lot, I spent an evening with a gentleman who was above a minister of finance. I mean, those guys were a dime a dozen in Iran. But he had real power, and it really mattered. And we talked for about 5 hours because he wanted to know what I would do if I was in his place. And I told him. And at the end of it, he kind of laughed at me and said, well, you know, that's why you're not a politician. Because what I told him, that now is the time when you can do it, when you have the leeway, you should get rid of these subsidies and you should do something else in its place. He asked me what. I said, well, be the first country in this area to wean yourself from oil revenues totally, maybe over a period of 10 years, and then instill some kind of a tax system, which will take some time, and then use this money that you have had in your oil revenues to invest abroad maybe use some of it domestically, but invest this abroad and issue a check very much like Alaska, but do it on a more scientific way over time. And he said, you know, the Iranian people would never believe us. If we ever took that money and we stopped any of these subsidies, they would think that we have taken this away on a permanent basis. We don't have that kind of a credibility. I said, well, if you go down this road more and more, you're going to even have less of a credibility and maybe even less money. Now, then what happened, and this was something that I always wore on my sleeve, and I said everywhere that I went, you know, there's some of us who talk about sex, this and that. This is the thing I always talked about, that's what all of these countries, in fact, ought to do. Because as long as they don't do that, there is just too much of an incentive for anyone who lives in these countries who has the power to make sure that they don't have decent institutions. Because why would I want decent institutions if I'm robbing the country? Now, once this money is taken out of the system in some way, and you put a very, very tight regulations on it, then you can, in fact, begin to do something and maybe build decent institutions. And so, anyway, what basically happened, he said I was wrong. Then, a wonderful man who really cared for Iran, who had been a vice president and the minister of finance, and he was the minister of finance of Iran during the 90s, or much of the 90s, Mohsen Nourbakhsh, who was very different than the other people who've been involved in the Iranian government. He had the guts and the courage to stand up. He had views, and he was willing to fight for them. And he stood up, and he was the person who in turn then created the Oil Stabilization Fund. He was the person who wanted to start the whole privatization program, but he died at a very young age. And so all of that stuff went out of the window. Now, I realize some of you say, well, there is an oil, there is an OSF. Yes, there is in Iran, but it doesn't function in the way that it was actually supposed to do so. In Iran, there's also, by the way, and people used to joke with me that I had an effect, and of course I realized that I never had any effect. Iran did pass the law, by the way, that they would wean themselves from this oil over a span of actually 10 years. It is the law of the land, but nobody obeys it. It was passed by parliament, but Mr. Ahmadinejad doesn't do anything about it. So they didn't wean themselves, and they've continued with the subsidies, and I think it's very, very simple. Why? Because this is how they have built their power base. And so when you look at the OSF today, by many people's calculation, it should have somewhere around 70 billion in it, because you went through a period of high oil prices, because the way Mohsen Nourbakhsh designed this thing, it was not a fund the way that I've talked about it. It was basically to compensate the government for oil price fluctuations. But I think by my reckoning, the OSF doesn't even have $20 billion in it today. And so when you look at now the Iranian economy, just to sum up, you have a country that has, is run maybe 65 to 70% is in the hands of the government, at least its economy. What they've also done is they have done this even more in a sense, because what the government has been doing has been given all of these large contracts, and that started with the oil ministry about 10, 12 years ago, that they began to give these large contracts to the Revolutionary Guards. And of course, what the Revolutionary Guards did, here's my friend in the oil business, they couldn't do this, so then they gave it to an Italian company, and they took their 10%. And so what has happened to the Iranian government is that they've needed all of this foreign exchange to enrich the Revolutionary Guards. They have, in fact, needed some of this to pay for their subsidies. And so when you look at Iran today, their FX reserves are much lower, in my opinion, than what the IMF says. Number two, another thing that has happened is that inflation in Iran is very, very high. I think it's actually laughable that the IMF says inflation in Iran has come down over the last year. I think some of these folks should go and stay there and buy chickens and buy eggs and buy yogurt, and they will know what's happened to inflation in Iran. And of course, what you read in the American newspapers, they say, well, the Iranian government cannot get rid of the subsidies because this will increase inflation. Now, when I went to graduate school, which is moons ago, if I kind of said that you were going to use subsidies as a policy to control inflation, I would never have been given a degree. It's like doing this. If I want to scratch this year, I go on. I mean, you target the policy to do that. You don't go ahead and say, well, you know, you need the subsidies in order to keep inflation down. And of course, it's an economy that you have high unemployment. You have very, very high Gini coefficients, namely income disparity. The difference between the rich and the poor has become very large. And it's very, very difficult for the average Iranian or a couple to be able to make ends meet in Iran. And on top of all of that, you have a country where I believe the Iranian rial is highly overvalued. And that's why when you talk to a lot of businessmen who need to buy imports, they actually buy most of their things, even apples, from Chile rather than from Iran, because it's cheaper and the quality is better controlled. So when you go on these rigs, when Total does its work in Iran, instead of buying apples, let me repeat that again, from Iran, they go and buy it from Chile. Why? Because the Iranian rial is so highly overvalued. So in conclusion, I think it's an economy, in my opinion, that is very vulnerable. And I don't know where they go from here. And
thanks, Hussein. We'll expand on where we go from here in the question session. Please, Kayvon.
Okay, thanks, Karim. Thanks to the Carnegie Endowment and Dr. Asghari for his remarks. And I've been living in Iran for the last 10 months. I returned a week and a half ago. And I personally suffered the effects of inflation because the suit I purchased in Tehran in August 2009, and it was about 20% more than the suit I had bought the year before. So it was really hit my pocketbook. I felt it personally. I'm a sociologist, actually, not an economist, but I was trained as an economist and then recanted, I should say, to the sociology. But we're still friends. I'm still friends. We're amiable friends. And I spent the last 10 months traveling around Iran as well as in Tehran. And of course, I saw many of the events that took place. We can talk about that later. Specifically, Karim wanted me to talk about the economy and move from the top to the bottom, from the macro to the micro, and my own perspective on that. When we're comparing Iran to other countries, it's important what countries we compare Iran to. If you ask your average taxi driver or businessman in Iran, of course, they'll bring up actually many of the countries that Dr. Asghari brought up. South Korea remains a major sort of ideal type North Star for many middle-income countries, including Iran, but also countries like Mexico and Brazil, Argentina, Turkey, you name it, Egypt. They all see South Korea as this thing that why aren't we at that level? But they should really be looking at each other and asking, why are we all the same? Iran has a large state sector. It has a decent private sector, but it really is sitting on a large informal sector, meaning it's sitting on a large group of small businesses that in Iran they say it's the open economy, Iqtisad al-Azad, that people who work in this sector, they don't get stable wages, they get income from multiple places, their lives are precarious, and this is 30-40% of the Iranian population. During the unrest after the elections, there were a lot of questions about what these sorts of Iranians thought about their relationship both to the government and the opposition, but it wasn't questioned probably enough because that group is really not discussed as much in the way that the Iranian economy is talked about today. But I wanted to make the point that Iran is a middle-income country, meaning that it's a country that is not this OECD group. It's also not the poorest strata in the world. It's in this large sort of strata of middle-income states like the ones I was mentioning before, Brazil, Mexico, Turkey, for example, Egypt. And many of these countries actually experience the same sort of problems as Iran. Youth bulges, high inflation, underemployment, large informal sectors that never withered away as they were expected to do with decades and decades of industrialization. We're not just talking about economic policy under the Islamic Republic, but going back since the Shah. That's the first thing I'd like to say, that when we look at Iran's economy, what should we be comparing it to? Second, how is the Iranian economy reported on when we look at the journalism profession? On one hand, especially reporters who work near the Iranian government, everything is always going up. I mean, everything is just going great. You look, they have these charts. I mean, it's amazing. They just release press releases. Things are just going great. We're exporting more. You know, it's never been better. And everything, there's no talk of crisis at all within this group. But there's another group that thinks that it has the discourse of crisis for the last 30 years, that the Iranian economy is on the verge of collapse, and it has been precariously balanced on some kind of cliff for 30 years. I would just like to proffer the understanding that this is a highly politicized discussion, and that anybody in Iran who gives an opinion on the economy usually has an agenda. And I found this, it was very difficult to speak to people in Iran about the economy because, first of all, you can say basically what you want in Iran about the economy. It's something that you can criticize the government very heavily on, including the conservatives who have just been laying into Ahmadinejad since basically he stepped into office on the economy. And, of course, many of the criticisms are quite valid. But behind the entire discussion is politics. So when you hear discussion over things like inflation, poverty, underemployment, growth rates, oil sector, every discourse goes back for 30 years of arguing. And each side has its own sort of assumptions and understandings that they constantly bring up. And so someone who enters into this conversation in the middle, let's say, June 2009 or now, really is entering into a rat's nest, basically. Karim asked me to say something good about the Iranian economy. And, these days, saying something good about the Iranian economy is quite a radical statement just in itself, anything good at all. But, part of my research there was spending time looking at health policy in Iran, the health system, the welfare system. That was part of my research. And if you go to the rural areas, you can actually see some of the benefits of the switch to primary health care in the rural healthcare system. You can see the effects of the policies on birth control and family planning, which Dr. Askari brought up. It wasn't just throwing condoms at people. It had a lot to do with convincing people that if they have 2 children instead of 7, they will be taken care of. So there are some things that are overlooked, especially, of course, by Iranians themselves, because they have nothing to compare themselves to. They're not familiar with the birth rates in places like Egypt and Turkey. Turkey has a higher birth rate than Iran. When this youth bulge that is so discussed in the media about Iran gets older, I mean, I am this bulge. I'm in it. I'm at the tail end of the bulge. I'm part of this 60% of Iranian youth. Now I'm 31, so I'm not under 30 anymore. But I was in the bulge. As this group gets older, there's not going to be a huge group of youth to replace them. And in that sense, Iran is actually different than many countries in this middle-income strata, which still suffer from higher birth rates. And any economist can tell you that in the future that actually would lead to higher per capita income. Okay, that was the good. Then I should probably switch to the bad because there's a lot of bad. I think that if you not using the crisis discourse on Iran for 30 years allows us to understand the nuances and changes in Iranian economic policy and the changes that people inside Iran feel over time. Because if you ask them, what was the best time period after the revolution? Was it the war? Was it Rafsanjani? Was it Khatami? They understand quite well how policies affect their daily lives. But to a certain extent, we don't, outside Iran, understand the nuances. And I think one of the main, if we can really critique economic policy of Iran, it's industrial policy. That Ahmadinejad has been perhaps the most free market, laissez-faire president of Iran since the revolution. That doesn't say he's totally laissez-faire because we have a very small sample here. But they assumed that we wouldn't have to continue supporting the domestic economy, domestic industry. And some of the inflation that resulted over the last 2 or 3 years was, in fact, from the destruction of internal Iranian sectors, whether it's agriculture, whether it is basic manufacturing. We're not talking about oil. We're talking about things that labor-intensive industries that kept many, many people employed. The labor unrest that you read about now is not just a consequence of the last 10 months, but a long-term buildup of grievances within the industrial working class of Iran, which is as a middle-income country, has a large industrial sector, has a working class. I'll leave some more remarks for the question and answer period, but I just want to give an example. In Tabriz, where I spent a month back in February, Tabriz has a domestic chicken industry, and they are livid that Turkish chickens are coming through the border. Partly this is a result of overvalued rials, which gives any Iranian tourist sort of a boost. They can go to Turkey and their rial is worth a lot, and they can actually have sort of their tourism is subsidized. But on the other hand, it's also that the planning for these sectors, which if you're a middle-income country, you have to plan which sectors you want to promote, which sectors you want to let go. This has all gone out. If you ask anybody in the government ministries, ask them where is the industrial policy, which in economics used to be where you spent your time working on. They said there's no such thing anymore. There's no such thing. There was a joke that the fifth development plan, the plan that the president just sent to the Majlis, it came on a CD, and the Speaker of the Parliament, Ali Larijani, got a blank CD in his box, and he said, well, I knew that the plan was thin, but not this thin. In Tabriz, these chicken farmers are just absolutely livid. Where's the government support? Where's the support for domestic industry? Talk about all these, helping out the Iranian people. But this is one of the examples where specific policies that affect people on a daily basis, can be directly related to government policy. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
For now.
Thank you very much, Ivan. And is it okay if I advertise your blog, or is that incognito?
You can advertise.
Okay, he's got a great blog. It's The Thirsty Fish, right?
Right.
Yeah, so you can Google him and find. He had a lot of very insightful, incisive writings before and after the elections. I think we're now going to dim the lights and light some candles and put on some Barry White for Farid's presentation. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I can't live without PowerPoint, being a consultant. I want to go through some of the vulnerabilities that the oil and gas sector in Iran faces, and just go through an inventory of different things that face this particular sector, the problems that the sector faces. Before that, I just want to go into a little bit on the world oil markets, just to contextualize Iran and some of the vulnerabilities it faces in the oil sector. Right now, we have, look at the bottom graph here, on OPEC spare capacity. After enjoying quite almost a decade of fairly low surplus capacity and therefore strong demand for its oil, OPEC now has spare capacity around 20% of its total capacity. So this is a problem facing OPEC going forward, and I want you to keep this in mind when I show you some other graphs in terms of new capacity coming online in the future. The reason that we don't have much lower oil prices is because most of that capacity is in Saudi Arabia, and they've been managing it very well. And they have convinced the market that they are willing to keep something like 4.5 million barrels off the market. And so there are not a lot of people fighting for extra market share because most other countries don't have that extra capacity. That most likely will change. Oh, and it's also that if you look up there, you'll see non-OPEC supply has actually been quite suppressed, partly because of the maturity of the rest of the world, and most of those bars that are positive are because of OPEC natural gas liquids that are coming off the extra OPEC gas production that's been going on. So even that has been accruing to OPEC in terms of NGLs. So keep that in mind. Now, not to be outdone by Goldman Sachs, we decided that they shouldn't only have an acronym, we wanted our own acronym. And so we came up with the BRINC countries, and that's Brazil, Russia, Iraq, Nigeria, and Kazakhstan. And the significance of BRINC is that they're going to be the new capacity expanders going forward. And you can see, I don't know if you can see, there's no scale. My graph has got no scale on it. Okay. Iraq is about another 1.5 million, the biggest bar in the middle. So that's what's on the horizon in the next 5 to 7 years, and this is an art, not a science, but that's what we think. So keep that in mind. And is this the right graph? Oh, okay, I see. this is what the Iraqi production profile is theoretically as what they want to happen. All these contracts out there that have been awarded, that this is what the government would really like to see. We think it's much more a more realistic number would be somewhere 6 million barrels a day. And in that sense, it would improve OPEC's comfort zone if they stuck to this. But nonetheless, think about, we're already at nearly 5 million barrels a day excess capacity in the world, and in the next few years, just Iraq alone will add another 6 million barrels a day. Now, we have to think in terms of depletion rates and non-OPEC, and you have to think in terms of increase in demand that's going to happen. But nonetheless, we have a situation where OPEC is going to be under a lot of stress, and this capacity is not only going to be with the Saudis, it's going to be now distributed not only in OPEC, but also in non-OPEC in Kazakhstan and other places. The other thing is that, and how it relates to Iran, is that in a sense, Iran's place in OPEC will be greatly diminished. It was always the sort of second most powerful country or third or somewhere in there, and always part of the deliberations. With Iraq coming back, Iraq starts to take that position. And in the old days, some of you will remember this, certainly Hussein will, during the Iran-Iraq war, when OPEC tried to deal with these two fighting OPEC members, they would say, okay, both of you get the same quota. We're sick and tired of you guys fighting. You guys get the same quota. Now, someone's brought that up in one of the recent OPEC meetings and said, okay, you can go back, Iraq, to about 3.5 million barrels a day, which was your quota. And they said, no more. That game is gone. We're not doing parity with Iran. What we're going to be doing is with Saudi Arabia. We're going to play parity with Saudi Arabia. And actually, we believe that the Baghdad-Riyadh axis is going to be where the oil price, in a sense, will be decided going forward. So this is quite a game changer and will really change the relative strength of Iran in the whole deliberations. We'll forget about that. This graph, in a sense, shows, a very busy graph, shows that the different threshold prices that each of the OPEC countries want in different years, because of what I did was take imports and divide it by, in a sense, and minus that non-oil exports, and so that diminishes how much burden is placed on oil exports to fund imports. And you get sort of like Iran at around $90 a barrel at a certain time, Venezuela at around 90, Saudi Arabia at 50. And so right now, most of the OPEC countries are in a fairly good place with the price at around $80 a barrel. But nonetheless, some of the high-cost producers, in terms of their total economy and its needs of the oil, are vulnerable to an oil price crash going forward. And that's why I bring this up for you to keep in mind. Not only are we going into a surplus situation, but these countries are actually coming, as they come into this surplus situation, are quite vulnerable to oil prices. Let me go into some of the structural issues in the oil and gas sector. You have three major problems in the oil sector. One is an aging sector. It's the oldest, pretty much in the Gulf, with the possible exception of Iraq. But Iraq is being rejuvenated. Enormous underinvestment in the sector for many reasons, and I'll go into that in a second. And then, of course, you have management and performance problems over the last 30 years.
That's specific to Iran you're talking about.
I'm talking specifically to Iran.
Something must have happened with the PowerPoint 2010. So a lot of these charts, the
Coming
are falling off. So we'll make sure to fix that.
I'll give.
Sorry about that.
As you can see, with an old, mature sector, you have quite a bit of a long period of oil reserve depletion. In fact, we argue that pretty much 75% of Iran's reserves have been depleted. So, and in most cases, that's pretty much catastrophic problem in a country like this. In fact, we feel that they grossly overestimate their reserves, and that was part of that sort of OPEC fights that used to take place back in the 80s and 90s, again tied to Iraq in terms of its parity with Iraq. But we think that basically overestimating or overstating their reserves by about 80 billion barrels. So it's quite a bit smaller than what official statistics tell you. You can see the production path of Iran in history, and that's sort of the basic dotted line is and the gray area is the historical production. What happens here is they had a massive crash. This is the 80s and early 90s, rebuilt it up, had the benefit of the buyback agreements, got a little bump up, but then you can see that the gray areas, the old production is actually declining and is in terminal decline. A little bump up because of the buybacks in the blue. The next, the dark blue. So you got that bump up, but then you're going to see a continuing decline from that going forward. If you see the PUDs, this is geology terms. I'm an economist, but it's the undeveloped reserves. So we expect that some of those will be produced, and then that will start to decline. And then you've got a little bit of exploration. Bottom line is that there's not much upside to this oil sector going forward, even with new investment coming in. Some of the big fields have seen an increase. That's the bump that came from those fields, but basically all of them are starting to go into their sort of terminal decline. One of the questions we're asked a lot is who buys Iranian crude? Now, this is from last year, and you can see it was largely India, China, and then a little bit of the rest of Asia. The Indians have really scaled back and started to cut back. The Chinese have started to cut back quite a bit. In fact, I have some other stats that show that China increased its imports and purchases from the rest of the world by something like 25% and has cut Iran by 20% over the last year. So everybody is in some sense reacting to the coming sanctions and are feeling the pressure on that front. So this is going to be much lower, and in fact what we're finding now, there are quite a lot of that oil that was to be sold in these terms contracts are being now put on tankers and held as stores. Let me go to the gas sector. Second largest reserves in the world, one of the most, could be enormous asset for Iran. The problem is that given the mature oil sector, a lot of gas is diverted to gas reinjection, which to keep the oil pressure up and keep the oil production up. It's in different places to a certain extent from its marketplace, the fields. So a lot of the gas is in the south, the markets are in the north. So it requires an enormous amount of infrastructure, some that I'm quite impressed with. They've put into place, but there's a lot that's needed continually. They are now, though, gas short as a country, ironically, and they are importing from Turkmenistan. That is a problem because there are a lot of suitors for Turkmeni gas, particularly China, that have the ability to pay. So they face an increased cost of imports. The last point is that LNG technology, great promise going forward, but the two things that are impeding. Sanctions, definitely, lack of technology and all of that are impeding the growth of LNG especially to Asia. But one other thing longer term, and this is a new factor that's come in, is that the world is becoming very rich in gas production. The phenomenon of shale gas in the United States, so the US doesn't need LNG anymore going forward. And lastly, that Australia is going to become as big a gas producer and potential exporter as Qatar is. So going forward, Asia will have its own gas supplies coming out of Australia. So that closes the window for Middle Eastern gas exporters going east and to a certain extent going west. So it's an interesting phenomenon that although the Middle East itself, and especially the Arab Gulf countries, are becoming major gas users, and in fact almost growing faster than most other parts of the world. As you can see, gas production has gone up very fast, but the utilization rate, the depletion of gas reserves in Iran are only about 10%. I had said much higher numbers in oil, but only 10%. So gas has a lot of way to go. The problem is the whole cost of development. But you can't see it on this. This is an amazingly bad. The demand line actually on the top graph was a red line that exceeded what Iran itself could produce for itself. So its demand, because it's so subsidized, has been growing extremely fast. This is the infrastructure. When I started and when you knew me back in the early 90s, there was only one line. It was called EGAT-1. So they've gone quite a few. They've built quite a lot of infrastructure over the last 2 decades. And that is to join up the fields and bring northern gas south, etc. So create a gas infrastructure. But there has been a lot of investment that has gone into it, and that I think has been quite impressive. The downstream sector, which is one of the most vulnerable areas, which is the refining and distribution, you can see, you've heard about the uncontrolled demand growth because of the enormous subsidies. There's a huge mismatch between what they produce and what they need, mainly that they don't produce enough gasoline for themselves, and that's because they subsidize gasoline. The ability of the national oil company, not only NIOC, but NIORDC, which is the refining company, to increase capacity, use their own crude, and then refine it. And of course, funding problems have been a major vulnerability. Very few capacity expansions, as you can see from the top graph, in the last decade. Lots of potential projects and talk about it, but very little new that will come online if you look at this table a little bit more closely. Some awarded here and there, but nothing of substantial amount, nothing close to what could close the window. They consume they import around 150 to 200,000 barrels a day. Now, in the last year, that they have been buying a lot more than that and storing it. So in a sense, they've got about 6 months of stocks right now. But none of this will really help alleviate their situation in the short to medium term. On general investment issues in Iran, the threat of sanction has definitely been a factor, and I'll show you a graph on that. But also the Iranians tend to over-negotiate every point, and that has been a real problem. And in fact, the joke is, I've repeated it elsewhere, but repeat it here, that you don't need sanctions. The negotiations will go on for so long that nothing will be built. And that contract terms have hardened over the years with the expectation, Iranians expected that, where would oil companies go? There was such a problem of access and problem of depleting reserves around the world, but that has not enticed many companies to come. As you can see, a lot of the fields that were awarded in the 2007 tender really went unawarded because of lack of interest, and so that has been a problem. And the Chinese, that's a lot of what people have said, hey, the Chinese are coming, the Chinese are going to save the day. There's been a lot of negotiations going on, but it is not translated into an enormous amount of investment and new production. Although the Chinese are still very much interested in developing these reserves. We talked about gasoline suppliers. These are our estimates of where the imports are coming from in the last part of last year. Some of the number of companies was much larger a year ago. It was the Shells, the BPs, Total, others were all supplying gasoline into the Iranian market. They all disappeared by last year. And you can see there's a few traders and a Kuwaiti company and Petronas and Total still were there in November, but basically some of the Totals of this world have disappeared and are not supplying gasoline to this market. Now, it's a fungible market to some extent, and there is some stuff coming into the UAE, and then it gets transshipped. So there are ways to in a sense disguise this trade. I believe, though, that sanctions in terms of gasoline sanctions will just lead to the further enrichment of the Revolutionary Guard. It's a great thing for governments to have this sort of thing and get their own cut of the trade. Finally, and Hussein has covered this, and I should just very quickly I'll only go through this very quickly. Dependence on oil has been huge. They are very vulnerable to the oil price. The subsidy bill has been enormous, and the access to finance has essentially dried up. I think one of the most successful parts of the sanctions has been that. And Iran historically has been very vulnerable to balance of payments problems. And as you can see from the debt crisis of the early 90s to the late 90s, when oil prices fell and they had to reschedule their debts again for a second time, they have had this constant vulnerability. Now, they've built up, let's forget this is not working. This is the subsidy bill, which is, as you can see, goes up, and I don't have the scale here to give you exact numbers, but it's rather high, let's put it that way. But debt levels have stabilized in the last decade, especially from the bad old days of the late 1990s. They did pay off quite a bit of the debt, external debt that they contracted in the early 90s. And then it stabilized for a while. It's not going to be going up because there are not going to be many people lending to Iran in the future. International reserves also were rebuilt. I mean, in 1998, it was $1 billion in international reserve. They brought it up to about $80 billion. They've started to fall, and they are vulnerable if the oil price declines, and they do need to import goods from outside, that they will only be able to use their reserves to fund that. On that note, I'll be quiet.
Thank you so much, Farid, and we'll go into more detail in the questions. Last but certainly not least, Matt.
Thank you, Kareem, and thanks to Carnegie. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be on a panel with people who know so much more about Iran and Iran's economy than I do. But based on my time as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intel at Treasury and on the research I've been able to do on the subject at the Washington Institute since, Kareem asked me to share some ideas about sanctions, where they have been, where they're looking to be under the Obama administration, and what we can expect in the near future. I can't tell you how many times journalists approached me, both right after I left Treasury and practically every week since, saying to me, well, you know, your sanctions, as if they were mine, haven't worked, so what do you think? Or they'd flip it the other way, sanctions clearly have failed, so what do you think? So much of this comes down to how you define success. I can tell you that when a whole bunch of people sat down, and I was privileged to be a part of it, to think through this idea of not kind of regime-wide shotgun sanctions, but targeted financial measures targeting the illicit actors and the illicit activities, in this case related to Iran's proliferation, terrorism activities in particular, the goal was not to end with sanctions and sanctions alone Iran's nuclear program. None of us thought that we were that powerful or that this was that capable. Frankly, as some of the other speakers have implied, we could never be as successful with our sanctions as Iranian leaders have been with their own economic mismanagement. But what we did think, and what I think we have seen significant success in, is three different areas. Maybe really only fair to say we've had success so far in two. The first is disruption. I think it goes without saying that we have successfully disrupted Iran's ability to easily access the international financial system, to easily access lines of credit and insurance and reinsurance, and to easily ship and transport materials. We've complicated things for them. And in the area of counterterrorism and counterproliferation, a whole lot of what we do is not solving the problem, but constricting the operating environment, making it more difficult for our adversaries to do what they want to do, even though we should also be spending time, and do spend time, preventing them from being able to do it at all or from wanting to do it, whether it's terrorism or proliferation. And that, I think, has been our biggest success. The second is there is an element of deterrence here. Iran is exceedingly good at the front company game, and they often find partners in the West, some here in the United States. There have been several big cases, certainly in Europe, people who sometimes are completely duped and other times know in part or in full that they are engaging in illicit activity on behalf of Iran, on behalf of Iran's proliferation, somewhere along that spectrum of maybe this isn't so kosher continuum. And there is the capability when you engage in these overt prosecutions, these overt designations, to deter people who really are in this for money from engaging in this type of criminal activity because the cost could just be too high. And so there have been several instances where individuals, businessmen, or entities in Europe in particular have been targeted, and we believe that that has had a significant deterrent effect on others like them who might be inclined. Now, the third area, and the one that is the biggest debate, which has not proven its mettle yet, is the ability to change the calculus. Usually people talk about changing the calculus of the regime, which to my mind is the revolutionary elements more than the elected elements, the ones who control the proliferation programs, etc. Could you, in other words, so put the squeeze on Iran financially and otherwise, diplomatically, military presence in the Gulf, that you could convince the regime that a nuclear program is no longer a guarantor of their survival, but a liability towards it? Increasingly, there's a different school that looks at the changing calculus not so much in terms of the regime, but in terms of the people. Can you so constrict the environment and expose the regime for looking out for everybody's interests but the people's that you can support human rights, democracy, green movement, what have you, and convince people to rise up from above? So there is this kind of clash, if you will, between even these two visions of the changing calculus, because one, when you come down to it, focuses on changing the calculus in terms of regime stability and security. The other comes down to changing the calculus in terms of regime change. And there are all kinds of schools of thoughts there. I think it's really important to understand the different types, the theory that is, of this targeted financial measure approach. And there are basically two ways to think about it. The first is there are sanctions that are targeted and there are sanctions that are broad. And the vast majority of the targeted financial measures that we have seen employed, bless you, are very targeted, focused on the specific illicit action and the specific illicit actor engaged in that action. You get tremendous buy-in from others. This is the anti-Iraq sanctions. It's not regime-wide shotgun sanctions. You get a lot of buy-in multilaterally on this. But as you've heard from some of our other speakers already, the IRGC is the element that is most involved in this illicit activity. And because of their dominance in the economy of Iran and because of the interrelationship between them and the Bonyads, they ironically are the best placed to be able to evade sanctions. And so they are going to be limited in their scope. Broad sanctions make people feel uncomfortable because they hark back to the sanctions against Iraq, which were ineffective in the sense that Saddam was able to very successfully abuse them. And the question is, do you want to be targeting or doing things that will squeeze the average Iranian? Or do you want to be doing things that will squeeze the illicit actors and therefore get the average Iranian on board? To me, the simple answer is you want to get the right cocktail. You want to get the right mix of both. And one of the things I was most proud of when I was at Treasury is that we started hiring in Treasury's brand new Office of Intelligence and Analysis, for which I was the deputy, not just really smart young intelligence analysts, but PhD economists. My pitch at the time was, the undersecretary, the deputy secretary is going to ask me, well, which action should we take? And my answer is going to be, what is the outcome you're trying to achieve? And what are the potential unintended consequences? I have a PhD, but it's not in economics. I can't tell you. Nor can my analysts. You have to go elsewhere. We brought in some PhD economists, and my pitch was, I can teach the PhD economists to be fantastic intelligence analysts. I can't teach my intelligence analysts to be fantastic PhD economists. And so one of the things that the government has been doing very, very well at the end of the last administration and through this administration is when they're thinking through the various tools, the tools we have, the 311 authority under the Patriot Act, the various executive orders, other things like gasoline sanctions, et cetera, formal sanctions and informal sanctions, both, they're thinking through what are we trying to achieve, what are the potential unintended consequences. And so I think, for example, that one of the issues there where this is getting a tremendous amount of attention is on the issue of Bank Markazi, the central bank of Iran. But I'm getting ahead of myself because not only do you have the issue of the targeted and the broad sanctions, as I just alluded, you have the issue of different levels of sanctions. You have both of the formal sanctions, and there you have multilateral sanctions primarily at the UN. You have regional sanctions through, for example, the European Union, and you have unilateral sanctions by the US, the UK, and others. And then you also have informal sanctions, which primarily has come down to US and others, governments going out, private-public cooperation, reaching out and saying, hey, here are the risks of doing business with Iran. And there, you're not getting buy-in because people are waving a flag, but rather because banks or businesses understand when you start talking to them about reputational risk and fiduciary obligations to shareholders and due diligence responsibilities. This started off, as you're well aware, with a huge push in the financial sector, and that continues. And I would hope and expect that in the coming UN Security Council resolution, one of the areas where they should be able to get some easy agreement is in, if you'll allow me to make up a word, multilateralizing some of the so far unilateral U.S. actions against some of the banks, but making that multilateral. But now we're seeing it move off into other areas of industry and business. And as you've heard, we're now seeing all kinds of businesses pulling out of Iran. We're only honoring existing contracts, et cetera. I think this understanding of the different levels of the formal sanctions is really important as we think about where we're going and we move forward. Because multilateral sanctions are very effective. They're very important. Getting international buy-in is really important. If we're ever to have truly crippling sanctions, it will have to be truly multilateral. But short of that, we cannot allow our desire to work multilaterally to force us de facto to work in a system that by definition is operating by lowest common denominator. What we're going to see, I think, in the next resolution, which will be in June, is the umbrella of international legitimacy that another resolution will provide. The teeth will come elsewhere in the EU and other unilateral sanctions that will follow from the US, the UK, and others. Some will be kind of overt, public, and some will be things that will be more quiet. So, for example, the US and the UK both have taken overt actions to designate or to list or to blacklist the Islamic Republic of Iran shipping lines, IRISL. I would hope that IRISL will be included on the next UN Security Council resolution. But even if it doesn't, there are other ways to skin that cat. For example, the Dutch have added IRISL to an automatic inspection list. It's not been done publicly. It's not a whole lot of fanfare. But the entry to Europe through the Netherlands is pretty important, some pretty key ports, and any ship that's done business with or is subcontracted by, et cetera, IRISL gets automatically inspected. So there are lots of ways to deal with this, and I think we have to think about that as we move forward. As we head towards June, I think that there's going to be a lot of progress. It's not going to happen until June because Lebanon has the rotating presidency. Next month, Hezbollah's intimacy with Iran is going to preclude movement in May. But in June, you'll have, I think it's Japan, and you'll have not only then an opportunity in the very first days of June, I hope, for a resolution, but you're going to have a coincidence, an opportune coincidence of different things in June. To understand that, let's go back to February. February, I think it was 18th. As my colleague Patrick Clausen, who's here, and I wrote at the time, saw two different reports come out, one from the IAEA highlighting the various ways in which Iran was still non-compliant with the international community on coming forward with what it is and is not doing on its nuclear program, and the other report that got a lot less attention, though in some ways was much more significant, was a new report by the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, which operates out of the OECD in Paris. They don't like being called the technocratic body, but they are. And they are one of these international bodies that works by consensus. And that's important because they include China and Russia, which have now both signed on to several warnings issued by FATF to all of its member states about Iran's deceptive financial practices, which it pursues in support of its illicit conduct. So you could be the best compliance officer in the top-rated bank in the world, and you're looking at a piece of paper that says there's a Turkish telecommunications company doing business in Cyprus, and there's no digging deeper when, in fact, it's actually some part of the Iranian military-industrial complex procuring something special for the nuclear program. that type of deceptive financial practice gets people's attention. The FATF has now issued several calls on all member states to take proactive countermeasures to deal with this problem. In February, they reissued that call, but they did so in a brand new context. The FATF had for some time issued a blacklist of non-cooperating countries, NCCs, that were non-cooperating on basic anti-money laundering standards, now also combating terror finance standards. They stopped doing that because they'd been so successful that all the countries that were on the NCC list became more cooperative, improved their standards, and the list ended. It ended in part not only because the countries that were on it improved, but because many of the member states of FATF felt that it was inherently political and they were not comfortable with it. Well, February 18th, they renewed the blacklist. And in its own special category, actually in a text box at the top of the sheet, is Iran, calling for the only state which the FATF calls for proactive countermeasures. In there, the FATF also says they give Iran until June to change. So you're going to have this confluence. International organizations love to point at each other. Often, for example, the U.S. Treasury will take an action, will say we're doing this in fulfillment of the FATF's call to take more action. FATF takes an action saying we're doing this in fulfillment of the G8's call to do more on illicit finance. You're going to see a lot of that. So in June, you're going to have the confluence of the UN Security Council action, the FATF deadline coming, and I think there's going to be a lot of interest in doing what can be done as opposed to trying to get everything possibly that can be done at the UN. And I think that even China wants that to happen because the bottom line is China does not want the multilateral angle to become so bogged down and so ineffective that the US, UK, France, and others say, you know what, this particular problem cannot be handled at the UN. We're going to deal with it in other channels where, frankly, China will have neither a vote nor a veto. The critical thing moving forward is trying to get enough in the UN Security Council resolution that it is not embarrassing. There are many states out there who, when you approach them and say, hey, look, here's something more you could do on Iran and it wouldn't cost you a dime and you wouldn't have to pass a new law, what they'll often say is, yes, we're fully compliant with UN Security Council resolutions. And then they'll fight tooth and nail when the next UN Security Council resolution comes up to make sure it's as watered down as possible. If this whole idea of targeted financial measures is to live on and be successful, what we need to do come June is make sure that we reintroduce something that one of my colleagues mentioned earlier, and that is credibility. The whole idea was we were going to say to Iran, here's the illicit conduct you're doing, here's the timeline for which you have to improve. If you do improve by then, we'll remove these sanctions. If you don't improve, we're going to have to do something more. For those of us who are parents, you understand. You tell your kid, I have 4 sons, believe me. You tell your kid, you can't do this. And the kid may test you, and the kid doesn't, and then there has to be a consequence or else you've lost all credibility. Well, we're pretty much now at the point where at the multilateral level, Iran isn't worried. We've lost all credibility because each UN Security Council resolution, it was supposed to happen quickly. It was supposed to have some teeth, if not a lot of teeth. Each one was less effective, took more time to agree upon, had less teeth, was less unanimous. June is the opportunity to have a UN Security Council resolution that will set another deadline. If that deadline is not met, there has to be a quick new resolution of some type, which means you start thinking about it in June in the event that Iran doesn't comply, so that you can renew credibility. Otherwise, we're going to be moving away from targeted financial measures, which are going to become less and less credible, and by default, into things that are broader by nature. And that's a problem because it shouldn't be a question of either or, targeted or broad. It should be what is the best mix to get where we want to be. Timing is going to be important. Consequence is going to be important. And I think one of the things that we have done collectively, not as well as we could have, is highlighting when we take an action, whether it's a U.S. unilateral action or an action at the United Nations, but specifically a U.S. unilateral action, highlighting the connections to some of the human rights abuses and the crackdown on democracy, especially as we highlight the illicit IRGC activity. By and large, it's the same people. It's the same individuals who are responsible, ultimately, for the proliferation program, the support for terrorism, and the crackdown on democracy. And I think that it would go a long way to add a 2-liner in the next designation saying, we may not be designating these individuals for this because our executive orders allow us to designate them for support for terrorism or for engaging in proliferation, but the fact is these same individuals are engaged in this other type of illicit conduct, and that is something we need to fix. Getting the right mix is going to be critical, but I think we have an opportunity to do it. And as we look forward to measuring success, we have to think, what are we trying to achieve? And so some of these actions are going to be focused on disruption. Some of them will be thinking about deterrence. And if we really want to start changing the calculus, we have to start tailoring some of these actions towards doing just that. And with that, I'll end and take questions.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was very insightful. And thank you all for being more concise than you're usually asked to be. I want to jump now into questions. If you can just please introduce yourself and also be as concise as possible. We have about 30 minutes, and you can just wait for the microphone. My former colleague, John Greenwald from the International Crisis Group in the back.
Thank you very much, Karim, and thank you to all of you who made presentations. I was struck by the description of the Iranian economy as being poorly functioning, inefficient, in bad shape, and not so much because of anything that's being done as a result of sanctions or a result of Western governments' policies, but by the Iranian government's own mistakes, its own policy misjudgments. Now, policymakers normally don't make tough decisions, politically unpopular decisions with their own domestic constituency unless they're faced with a very serious situation. So I wonder to what extent, whether if the sanctions regime was made truly hurtful, the result might not be that those policymakers faced with the necessity to do something about their economy would simply make the right policy decisions economically, which could mean perhaps that the result of a strong sanctions regime would not be what the Western states would desire with respect to the nuclear program, but in fact simply a stronger, more effective Iran. Is that a fair speculation, or at least a plausible speculation?
Who wants to, you want to address that, Hossein? Kayvon? Floor is open, you guys.
I think that in the case of sanctions, I think what the United States says, it's its goal, I think it's very important. If the United States says our goal is to deter Iran from its nuclear enrichment program, in that case, I believe the Iranian people, by and large, would be more behind the regime, no matter what the sanctions are. I think that's why a lot of people have said that if the United States wants to be successful, it's the human rights and other things that have to be at least espoused as the thing that the United States wants to change. Without a doubt that the Iranian government, in my view, has never really felt the need to undertake the tough decisions. It has never been forced to, because it's managed to limp along. As this gentleman again told me in 1992, as long as people have enough to eat, we're okay. And and I think that's basically been their attitude. But also you have a lot of really conflicting things going on in Iran. Mr. Ahmadinejad will kind of pull out a puppet, or who will exactly say things that just do not make sense, that you can increase your credit at, let's say, 30% a year, and inflation will go down. It's kind of tough, and that interest rates have no relationship to inflation, nominal interest rates. And, all of these things are said. So there is, in a sense, they don't have the guts. I totally agree. I think also part of that is misunderstanding what they're actually doing. I mean, there was a gentleman in Parliament who I guess it was actually 4 years ago, he was arguing that the gasoline subsidy should be increased. And they had a very hard time understanding that that particular subsidy was a regressive subsidy. The people who benefited from that were really the rich. And when you try to explain that really to the poor people, they said, look, this is the only thing we get from this regime. No matter what it is, regressive or something, at least we get something. We don't want to get rid of that. And they couldn't understand that, in fact, they consume very, very little gasoline compared to the other people. So I really don't believe that they will undertake the right economic decision until their backs are totally against the wall. And I don't think that they're there yet.
I think that we should clarify the term that Secretary of State Clinton used to describe the Iranian economy. She described it as a military state. I think better would describe it as a military contractor state. And we've already heard some evidence on that today, that, you know, the IRGC, it's still a huge debate, by the way, inside Iran and the Iranian press, how the role of the IRGC and its agencies, or just the role of former Revolutionary Guard members and their companies and the international economy. If they're simply taking a 10% cut on government contracts, I don't see much difference between the Revolutionary Guards and the Chinese Communist Party. For example, Donya Iqtisad just had an article a couple of days ago, one of these main, sort of the Economist magazine of Iran, had an article about the main engineering firm that is linked to the IRGC, Khatam al-Anbiya, boasted in the article that was quoted by this newspaper that they had procured 20 to 40% of their inputs in their new investments in the South Pars field in the southern Iran that they've been investing in, procured inputs from Germany and Korea. So it doesn't seem like they're too worried about any type of sanction, shotgun, or I don't know what's the alternative, sniping, a sniper rifle. On the relationship between sanctions and economic reform or economic policy, the real sort of problem in Iran is that, and maybe it's a problem generally with middle-income countries, that they believe that economic reform requires less state involvement. And you hear this a lot on the whole gamut of Iranian sort of economic discussions in Iran, that opening up trade, backing off on subsidies, freeing prices, requires the state to basically get out of life. What we've learned from the subsidy reform, or attempts to reform the subsidies, or whatever is going to happen, it was supposed to happen already and is not going to be happening till the fall, changing in subsidy policy, is that in fact it requires a stronger state. It's actually the easiest thing in the world to just make a general subsidy at the level of the point of production or point of consumption. But in fact, it requires a stronger state to target subsidy policy, because you have to have, you know, decent information about who is living where, about your population, and policies need to be targeted accordingly. So in that sense, the strength of the state is important in relationship to the way that the economy moves. And the unrest that occurred after June weakened the state. And it's actually much misguided to say from the United States that the Iranian state has been strengthened or centralized. I think that's a big myth. I think that the Iranian state, as a set of as an apparatus, is highly fragmented, and some of the fragmentation is a relationship to this military contractor, situation going on, and a lot of it is the way in that the state was actually weakened by the unrest and has not recovered. Of course, this is why they boast about how strong they are. It's sort of inverse relationship. But I think there's a direct outcome that the failure in subsidy reform and the failure in these economic reforms, even if they have a clue of what they should be doing, is a relationship to the unrest that occurred and probably will be still occurring as we continue to watch.
I just add briefly that on the issue of Khatam al-Anbiya, one of the things we've seen many times is, especially in Iran, bragging publicly that the sanctions aren't working, look at all the contracts we have, and then noticing that they don't actually exist. I actually find that as a particularly interesting metric. But it's interesting, it's one that makes it into the press all the time. Well, look, the sanctions aren't working. Here they're bragging of their contracts, and they're actually contracts that don't exist. But there's danger in kind of writing off the sanctions as, look at all the things that could go wrong. And I say it that way because, again, this is not a knee-jerk thing. People really do think very, very carefully what sanctions should be done, why this one, why that tool, what's the goal you're trying to achieve. I don't think that it's possible. I agree that I don't think that they would make economic reforms unless there was a knife at their throat. But even if they wanted to, if the right sanctions are put in place, it's too little too late. It's very, very difficult to do that when you're denied access to the national financial system, when you can't repair your oil economy because you can't get access to the key technologies. There's another misnomer out there that simply this will give the regime a a target to blame the outsiders for everything, but that doesn't seem to have worked either, especially since the elections. Let's be clear, this is not a panacea, and sanctions on their own, not combined with other parts of policy, are not going to be effective. But the right sanctions can be extremely effective.
I want to bunch together a few questions at once now, if we can. In the back, please. There's two of you. You can both ask a question.
Thank you, panel. A couple of questions. One is with regards to Central Bank of Iran.
Briefly.
Central Bank of Iran. Is that the serious threat to boycott Central Bank of Iran, or is it practical sort of threat? Secondly, what portion of Iranian economy is controlled by various bonyads, which are not answerable to the government, but to the Supreme Court? Thank you.
I believe right in front there was a couple of rows in front.
Thank you, George Lopez, USIP. Probably for Matt, I really appreciate your concern about credibility, but I wonder if there's not an irony that's happened over the last few months, and that is, while we haven't been able to get credibility on passing through yet the sanctions through the Security Council, if you look at the economic indicators, particularly the fear factor, you actually may have increased your effectiveness by the threat and uncertainty of sanctions even before you impose. And I'd like your reaction to that. Second is a quick one, and that is that you mentioned a number of times illicit financing, and it mostly is related to the counterterrorism area. There's another level of illicit, which is the kinds of things we discovered in the North Korea sanctions, where in going after non-proliferation networks, we discovered counterfeiting and the like. And what's your own assessment about the way that the international banking community might have revealed to it soon, with the imposition of these sanctions, networks which really drive FATF and others in a different direction and really destroy the credibility of Iran in the financial sector?
Anyone else? Please, in the front.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask if I'm Bob Dreyfus with the Nation magazine. If you could comment about the legislation that Congress is seemingly about to pass through Congress, and to what extent, first, what effect do you think the legislation will actually have in the real world? To what extent does the White House trying to get it to, be able to waive or weaken the impact of the bill? And what do you think is going to be the ultimate outcome if that bill passes the way it's written now?
Why don't you start up?
I feel loved. Regarding Central Bank of Iran and Bank Markazi, there's no question that the U.S. government and others have been signaling this for some time. There have been several statements by senior officials talking about how some of the banks that have already been targeted have moved that illicit business to Bank Markazi, and so they've kind of foreshadowed not only that we have the intelligence that Bank Markazi is involved in illicit financial activity, and I'll get to you in a second, but let me be clear, it's absolutely not. The illicit finance is absolutely not just terrorism, proliferation and other things as well. It's a political question about whether or not you want to take that action and what it would mean to the international oil economy and that type of thing. My sense is that if nothing else, it is an extremely effective bargaining tool where you go to other allies and say, look, we actually have a tremendous amount of intelligence and information that we can share with you at one level or another about Bank Markazi's illicit actions. You're uncomfortable with that, China, because, well, you may have reduced by 20%, but you're doing other business. Then here's some other things that you can now agree on, and maybe it's being used that way. We'll find out exactly where that falls in June when we have these sanctions.
Matt, is there any precedent to a central bank being sanctioned?
On the first Gulf War, we sanctioned the Central Bank of Iraq. Okay. Sure, I mean, that's a non-question. And in terms of the sovereignty issue, we've already targeted for sanctions elements of the government as well. That's a non-issue. In terms of the bonyads, if I had the answer to that question, I'd be a very wise and very wealthy man. Maybe someone else does, but this is a huge problem, not only for those of us up here, for me as an academic today, but it was a problem for me in terms of some of the gaps we have when I was serving in other capacities. In terms of the irony of the credibility, I don't think it's an irony. I think that there's actually a confluence of good things here. This fear factor has less to do with the fact that we haven't been able to move forward on the formal multilateral sanctions. The fear factor we've seen is because of the success of the informal sanctions and because of the raging debate over the congressional gasoline sanctions. So you have countries that are getting out now before anything passes. You have companies like Total saying, we're not out yet, but if there is a gasoline sanction, we will be out. And there has been, I think, a fear factor is a very good way to put it, and it has had a very big impact. There is utility in being able to say, look, work with me so that we can get some reasonable sanctions. Otherwise, God knows what Congress will do. There's always utility in when you're in the administration, being able to say, I'm the reasonable one. Look at what the Hill's going to do. That can prompt people to be forthcoming as well. North Korea example of the Banco Delta Asia example isn't as parallel as many people think. The North Korea example was a 311 action. There's a whole different panel we could have on the fact that while the 311 action, the threat to be able to keep someone out of the U.S. financial system because they pose too big a risk by virtue of the illicit activities that they engage in, is the backbone to the private-public engagement. I'm sharing with you information about Iran's illicit activities. Please take them to heart and change, because otherwise I may have to deny you entry into the U.S. financial system, not as a punishment, but because I can't expose myself to your risky behavior. We've actually never done that with Iran. 311 has never actually been used in the context of Iran, which is a whole interesting discussion and debate, because many in government think that that would be perceived as being political. And the fear of undermining the tool by using it in the wrong context versus the other side of the debate, which is the fear of undermining the tool by not using it in some of the most important contexts. I've spoken a lot, so maybe I'll let some other panelists talk more about the congressional legislation.
I think actually we'll do another round of questions. And I know there was a gentleman in the front here who had a question, and I'm trying to increase the gender balance, but I don't see any females asking.
That won't work with me. Sinan Ülgen, I'm with the Transatlantic Academy of the German Marshall Fund. It will be somewhat of a perverse analogy, but if I may. We've talked at great length about the supply side of sanctions, so what the international community wants to impose. And I would like to hear a bit about the demand side of the sanctions. You are in tune with what's going on in the country. What do the people of Iran expect in terms of sanctions?
Very good question. Let me actually pose a question for both Farid and Hussein. Farid, a few years ago, there was these studies which came out which said that in a decade it was conceivable that Iran could become a net importer of oil. Because if you looked at the graph, their oil production was going down because of lack of reinvestment into the energy infrastructure. And simultaneous to that, their oil consumption was going up because there was a demographic boom and there was very little conservation. Has that dynamic changed? I know they've tried to insert some conservation measures, but is that still realistic? I think there was even a PFC study which said something along those lines. And for Hussein, I plugged Kayvon's blog, and another thing I would like to plug are some of the articles which Hussein wrote in the aftermath of the elections, which I thought were just superb, written for, it was the National Interest, I believe, if you go to the National Interest and Google and do a search for his name. And you talked about you advocated instead of sanctions, but monetary pressure on Iran. And if you can expound on that a little bit. And if there's any more questions, if there are not any more questions, I'll hand it over back to one more in the front.
My name is Josh Ryman. I'm with the Woodrow Wilson Center. I wanted to just ask a quick question about subsidies. The first is, why do you guys think that the Iranian government is pursuing this big subsidy plan at this moment? They just think that it's unsustainable. The current system is unsustainable. And also what your thoughts are on Ayatollah Khamenei kind of interjecting himself into the subsidy debate after Parliament was cutting it down, and then he came in and offered his support for the full $40 billion subsidy plan, and Larijani kind of switched his position and so on. What your guys' thoughts are on the dynamic at play between the IRGC and Khamenei and the subsidy plan? Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we go right to left? Farid, please.
You're quoting reports that we wrote, and you're holding us accountable. Yeah, I guess if you straight line where, in terms of their consumption going forward, you could see that they could become net importers if you add up gasoline and other products, and which would exceed their exports of crude oil, because I don't think they'll ever be able to build enough refining capacity to refine it at home. But that would be catastrophic for Iran, obviously, because the revenues would start to decline.
About 80% of their export revenue is oil, right?
Exactly, and their budget revenues and all of that. And so I don't think we'll get that. So yes, it could theoretically happen, but I don't think it's going to get that.
But what have they taken measures to because they haven't really taken measures to increase output, right? The investment has not been coming in.
In terms of crude oil, they have taken measures, but as I showed you badly, that production is going to stay basically flat, or crude oil production, and demand for product has been going up quite rapidly.
Okay, very interesting. Awesome.
Yeah, if I may first disagree with my friend of many years here. One of your competitors, Feridun Fesharaki, doesn't agree with you about Iran's actually refining capacity going 3 years out. I think Feridun thinks that within 3 years they, in fact, will have a substantial increase in refining capacity. On the sanctions, I would have to say that the only sanctions, in my view, that have been effective, that have been a deterrent, have in fact been the financial sanctions. I think if you ever needed a proof of that, that's why Stuart Levy was kept on. The only person that was kept on, because I think that was an effective part of this, and I think Stuart Levy really understands this stuff, and I think he's done a magnificent job. But having said that, I think that in the case of Iran, there are other things that the United States can do, but I think they've been very reluctant to do it, and I think the Iranian community has been reluctant to it. Let me just expand on that, because that's what you asked me to do. As you all know, in the United States, we're one of few countries that we have to pay taxes on our worldwide income. And also, as I think you know about OFAC within the Treasury, it is in fact illegal for an American or an American resident to invest in Iran. You need a license. Now, one of the things that has happened over the years, Americans have in fact invested in Iran. There have been massive movements of capital into Iran. Of course, they don't go to a bank and transfer the money. They're not that stupid. They give the money to somebody here, and they get rials in Iran. And why they have done that is that in the case of Iran, interest rates have been, again, it all depends on about 3 to 5 year deposits have been running anywhere between 15 to 24% over the last 10 years. And Iran's exchange rate, I think, over the last 10 years, I would say it's probably moved a total of maybe 30%. So again, simple economics would tell you that if you had invested in rials, you would have made out like a bandit. And of course, the government always advertises that this really is a fixed rate. It's not a flexible rate. So one of the things that you can do, if Mr. Obama would give Mr. Levy the right to say this, because he would need his right. He would get up in the morning and say, we love you, Iranian Americans. We love you. You've been wonderful people. You've very much contributed to this country's growth. But maybe none of you knew that you're not supposed to have invested in Iran. So we're going to give you a chance. We'll give you 6 months. And in that period of 6 months, if you bring your money back, pay your taxes, it's all forgotten. No problem. But if you don't, then we may have a problem. And of course, everybody knows that the IRS will pay 10% if you come and give them good information. Now, the Iranians don't have a good history of all sticking together. Anybody who knows about what Iranians do, they cannot stop. They can love to fight each other. And if you go ahead and read anything about the history of panics, anyone living in Iran who thinks that there's going to be a massive movement of capital outside is going to do what? They're going to want to take their money out before. That is how panics start. And if a few Iranian Americans start to also want to take their money out, this would also put a pressure. And every one of my classmates that I've mentioned this to when we went to school together, who know anything about panics, they all say, before I even get done, he said, well, the Iranian government would never let that happen. They would, in fact, have to impose currency controls. And once you start doing that, you will turn the bazaar merchants against you because a lot of them would not be able to take their money out. There'll be a panic in the Iranian economy. And I think that this would really start a run on the rial. And in fact, I won't mention names, but I have offered somebody in the administration my house, 10-to-1 odds against his house if he wants to take the bet on me. And this gentleman smiled and wouldn't take the bet. I am that sure that, of course, that would have that kind of an impact. But I'm one of those folks, and here I disagree with Matt. I think there are many, many things that the U.S. could do in the financial area, but they haven't done them. It took them years to do the U-turn, as he knows. It took, on real products, we used to import gasoline, Iranian refined products, all the years until Mr. Clinton became the president. And we said we had an embargo on Iranian oil. I mean, it doesn't take a genius that you can ship the crude into the Caribbean and refine it and bring it into Iran. So I don't think that really the Treasury is doing all that it can to, in fact, tighten the screws on Iran. And I think that could be done.
No, I would just clarify to say that we're in violent agreement. The issue is not what more can be done, what other ideas are out there, but it's a political decision to decide what proper mix could be done. The U-turn example is a great example. When we first started targeted financial measures, it was graduated. So instead of denying all banks the U-turn, we denied Sadarat the U-turn, and other banks were allowed. Later, all banks were denied the U-turn. At first, Sadarat was only denied the U-turn. Then it was later fully designated. Though, by the way, just denying the U-turn had all the same impact that a full designation would have had. The real question is under what conditions the current administration will decide to let the gates open and enable the administration to do all the things that it could do. And there is this kind of flip. During the Bush administration, people were doing everything that could be done on Iran and on North Korea because people were trying to pursue the six-party talks. There was a slowdown on North Korea. Obama came in and inherited a situation where there had been more North Korean nuclear tests and missile tests, and suddenly it was do everything you can in North Korea, but hold off on Iran because we want to, depending on how you interpret it, try full negotiations or expose Iran for saying they want but really not wanting negotiations. Well, now all that's come and gone. Now the question is, come June, it's clear they want the UN Security Council first. What then will be the U.S. unilateral and other actions that everybody is promising will happen? And the violent agreement, I certainly think there's a lot more that could be done, and I expect that some of those things will happen.
I've been living in Tehran for the last 10 months, and one thing I just realized that you talk more about sanctions in D.C. than we talk about it in Tehran. The question was asked, what do Iranians think about sanctions? Many of them think that they would have no effect. Many of them think that they're some kind of magic bullets, but that opinion has been slowly decreasing, or quickly decreasing perhaps. And then there are the people who actually deal with the effects of sanctions on a daily basis, like many businessmen I spoke to who treat Dubai like their personal Cayman Islands. And have literally a post box in Dubai and use that as their ways. And I mean, Matt knows maybe better than me how to stop that. But from my perspective of speaking to people who affected this literally, in their personal business, I've never seen anybody, really take it hard. On the question of subsidy reform and why it happened now, I wrote an article exactly about that question in Middle East Reports, which came out while I was in Iran, just about. I think the issue is out now, Middle East Reports, merip.org, right? And that specifically addresses the question, why now, with all the unrest, why would the government even dare to do something so unpopular? And I'm not going to preview it, so you can go and read it in that.
That's a very good piece, actually, which I would plug. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I could sit in here and listen for a long time, but I wanted to thank you all for coming and thank all the panelists for making this dismal science far less dismal. Thank you.